So this is a special presentation of Scandal and Crime in Victorian era Britain. My name is Anthony Hannon, and I'm the Forever Scholars moderator for today. The presentation, if you were here before, it's going to be 60 minutes long. It's about 45 minutes to 50 minutes of a lecture, followed by a Q&A session, about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll address them at the end of the lecture. And so, as many of you know, today we received the news that Queen Elizabeth II has died. And before we begin our presentation tonight, I really would like to take a brief moment of silence to honor Britain's longest reigning monarch. So let me just... Thank you, everyone. And so again, as people are joining, if you're just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're logging in from. And before I introduce Professor Taddeo, I got it right, I'd like to mention that we have a 5-week live online course with Professor Taddeo starting on October 6th. The course is limited to 30 participants and is 5 live sessions. Each session is 90 minutes, comprised of 1 hour of lecture time and 30 minutes of class discussion. Every session is recorded, just in the event that you missed a class or you want to watch it back. It's just like a college class, but at a fraction of the cost at only $295 per person. There's no homework and there's no grades, and it's a really great opportunity to take a deep dive into British history. And so let me post that link if you're interested in the chat now. And so without further delay, I'd like to welcome Professor Julie Ann Taddeo. Professor Taddeo is Research Professor of History, British History, might I add, at the University of Maryland. She received her PhD from the University of Rochester. She previously taught at Temple University and the University of California at Berkeley, where she was also the Assistant Director of the Center for British Studies. She is the author of Lit and Strachey and the Search for Modern Sexual Identity and several articles on British modernism, sexuality, and 20th century popular culture. Her edited collections include Conflicting Masculinities, Men in Television Period Drama, Upstairs and Downstairs, British Costume Drama Television, From the Forsyte Saga to Downton Abbey, Catherine Cookson Country on the Borders of Legitimacy, Fiction and History, The Tube Has Spoken, Reality TV and History, and Steaming into a Victorian Future, a steampunk anthology. Her current project examines rape and contemporary debates about sexual violence in period drama television. She is the resident area expert on the royal family and frequently gives public lectures on British popular culture. Well, welcome, Professor. It is very nice to have you. And of course, at such an interesting time. So before we begin tonight's presentation, I just wanted to give you a moment to share your thoughts on the events of today, and for viewers who may or may not know, maybe what we could expect to happen in the next few days and what kind of impact this is going to have on Britain and the world.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Anthony, and I'm so happy to be here with Forever Scholars. So welcome, everyone. I don't think the news was a great surprise because we've seen the Queen looking very frail lately. But just back in June, you were in London for the Jubilee, and I was giving talks about the Jubilee. So this is kind of a sad epilogue to that. There will be several days of mourning now, and we'll see a lot of news coverage, international coverage, tracing her legacy, reminding us of, the high points and the low points of 70 years on the throne. And now we await to see what Charles III will be like as the next monarch. He is now taking that title. And the nation, of course, is one that's facing a lot of internal divisions. And hopefully he can be that guiding force and unifier the way that his mother had been.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I guess with that, we can turn it over and talk about another era, the Queen Victorian era. So if you would like to start your lecture, it's all yours.
All right, let me bring up my slides. Yes, in fact, Queen Elizabeth II was the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and they shared a lot of similarities. So if you take my class, that's one of the things that we'll be talking about. So I don't want to give it all away now. Okay, so welcome to Scandal and Crime in Victorian Britain. All right. I do have a website, juliantaddeo.com, and you can also find my books on Amazon in case you're interested in learning more about my work. The Victorians are big business in popular culture. You can't turn on your TV set or a streaming site without finding a period drama that is set in the 19th century. So some of you may be familiar with the Victoria miniseries about the early days of the monarchy. Or if you like shows that are a little grittier, that give us a version of the 19th century that's a little sexier and more violent than it probably was, you might want to watch a show like Ripper Street or Penny Dreadful, Frankenstein Chronicles. And then there's one Dickens adaptation after another for both the big and small screen. There's something about this time period that seems to resonate with us today. Yes, it's very remote in many ways, but hopefully what you'll see tonight, and if you take my class, is that we share a lot with the Victorians in the way that they structure their world and think about gender and class and their fascination with scandal and crime. How many of you love your crime podcast? Well, it's very similar to the Victorians' love of sensation novels and tales of Gothic tales of horror. One story I'll be coming around to towards the end of my talk, Jekyll and Hyde, published 2 years before the Jack the Ripper killings in 1886, speaks to one of the themes of tonight about the duality of humans. The Victorians like to see themselves as rational creatures, that they were in control. And yet what we see in some of these crimes that made headlines and that the public gobbled up is that they were increasingly aware of this new modern idea in psychology, that we did have a darker side. You didn't have to drink a magic potion to unleash that beast within. I love this image here because it speaks so much to this darker side of the Victorians, that underneath that veneer of respectability and decorum could lie danger and death. This is an age in which syphilis is the top third killer. So especially regarding sex, while we like to think of the Victorians as prudes, they do have this darker side as well. So there's lots of warnings in the scandals and crimes that I'm talking about tonight about how to properly behave and what happens to you when you do break the rules. It's the spectacle of death, especially murder, that was central to Victorian popular culture, just as it is today. And the newspaper, they sold lots of papers, especially when it involved crimes that would warn the public, primarily women, about what would happen to them when they broke the rules. And this is, of course, a society that seems very stuffy at times, and yet they gobbled up stories like Sweeney Todd, who turned people into mince pies. And they love stories of mummies and vampires and ghosts. And warnings to women, you don't die for fashion. And in fact, I'm going to give you an example tonight where women literally did die for fashion. Okay, but as our segue to our first main topic, a crime that also caused many scandals in the 19th century, I want to reintroduce us to a clip from a movie I'm sure lots of you are familiar with from the late 20th century, Young Frankenstein.
What a filthy job.
Could be worse.
How?
Could be raining.
Oh gosh, that scene always makes me laugh. But it was no laughing matter. In this particular crime, it's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. And that job was robbing graves, resurrectionists, the resurrection men, as they were called. And while this particular crime predates our Victorians, it was already occurring in the 18th century. By the early 19th century, it was becoming so problematic, and it led Parliament to pass a law, as we'll see. But it's a crime that even after the law is passed, continues well into the Victorian era, and it becomes the stuff of popular fiction in the Victorian period as well. So the Victorians were reading about it. The crime of grave robbery, body snatching, is linked to innovations in medicine. And so the careers of upper class and upper middle class men depend upon the deeds or the misdeeds of these resurrectionists. I just want to give a couple of examples, though, from 19th century popular culture, which shows how readers were fascinated with this particular crime. Of course, Frankenstein is published in 1818, so a couple of decades before the Victorian era. But Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein cannot create his creature or monster, and there's been so many, right, different depictions of him. He can't create it without getting the corpses from grave robbers. So, and he stitches all those pieces together. Dickens, in the Victorian period, published his novel, A Tale of Two Cities, which is set in the 1790s, right, the French Revolution. And his comical character, Cruncher, is a grave robber who's hoping to pass his trade on to his son. So it is the stuff of 19th century fiction, but it's based in reality. All right, this is a great image where it shows the anatomy class. By the early 19th century, physicians wanted to push out those they perceived as quacks from their profession. They didn't want to have to compete with them. And so the requirements for becoming a doctor were getting stricter. It involved university education, you had to know Latin, and you had to have anatomy class. So here are all the students watching the professor give his anatomy discussion lesson. But where are those corpses to come from? As more and more men, especially of the upper middle classes, were training in this profession, there simply were not enough bodies for anatomy class. Now, the bodies that were allowed by law were those that were hanged criminals, hanged at the gallows. And here we see the scaffold. It is the tree which bore fruit endlessly. And waiting at the foot of the gallows would be surgeons from the nearby teaching hospital, waiting to claim the corpses. And this particular sketch shows how the surgeon is competing with the family member for that corpse. It's a precious commodity. Now, there would be poor people who often stood outside of these teaching hospitals trying to prevent this crime, and sometimes staged resurrection riots because they understood that it was mostly their bodies, of course, that were being used. Now, the question is, who owns the dead? Once you're dead, is your body even property? Now, the crime of grave robbery wasn't about robbing the body itself from its resting place. You only got in trouble if you took any of the possessions that that person was buried with. Okay, I love this sketch too by Thomas Rowlandson, because the popular belief at the time was that your body had to be whole to meet your maker. So dissection was so dreaded by people, and it was associated with criminality because only hanged criminals had this terrible indignity performed upon their bodies. So here we see these corpses in search of all their missing body parts because they can't meet their maker till they reclaim them. Now, if you had money, you didn't have to worry so much that the corpses of your loved ones would be sold to the anatomists. And there's a whole industry then that is built around this. Some really clever folks who can make some money preying on your fears. So the mort safe, which would protect the grave. Some people just paid guards to stand watch for 3 nights because after that, the body would be decomposing and doctors wouldn't want it. Some invented these explosive devices. So if you approach the grave, boom. So basically, it was the bodies of the poor who were stolen. They couldn't afford these inventions, and they couldn't afford to pay guards to stand watch. Now, it wasn't just these grave robbers who tended to be working class men. Sometimes medical students themselves engaged in grave robbery. They were very ambitious. Now, in general, the public sort of accepted it, that this was just what happened. It's when the line gets crossed from grave robbery to murder that a public panic ensues. And this happens in 1828, so a few years before our Victorian period officially begins. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story of Burke and Hare. So these two guys ran a lodging house in Edinburgh, Scotland. And a lodging house is not a nice hotel. It's a place where people who really are kind of down on their luck, where they stay. You can pay for a bed for the night. So one of their customers ended up dying of a fever. And they decided that rather than alert the authorities, they would make some money. And they sold the body to the local surgeon, who was very well known for his anatomy class. So sometimes people, like journalists, would buy tickets to witness these dissections. So this particular surgeon asked no questions. he surely noticed that there was no dirt on the body, and yet he took it. And they made 7 pounds, which would be several $100s at the time. So actually quite a lot of money, which they realized they could get a nice business out of this. And so they proceeded to lure people to their lodging house, get them drunk, drug them, then smother them, and then at night sneak the bodies and sell them to that surgeon. And he asked no questions. Eventually, when they're caught, they were arrested for 16 murders. There possibly were more. But these, again, were people who really no one would even miss. And that's why they chose their targets so carefully. So it's, as I said, it started innocently enough, and then got really ugly with murder. And the two men basically turned on each other. And it was Burke and his wife who stand trial. But Burke takes the fall, and he will go to the gallows and be executed. The surgeon himself, this is an interesting side note, Robert Knox, everybody knew that he was involved, and yet Burke exonerated him. So he never had to stand trial. But it did hurt his career and his reputation. So he left Edinburgh and moved to London, where he became a pathologist. But one of the bodies that was brought to him, he fell in love with. This is a little side note here. Mary Patterson was 18 years old, and there's some dispute. There are some who say she was a prostitute. She had fallen in love with one of Knox's medical students, and they had a relationship. And then he dumped her. And it was at this point where she met up with Burke and Hare, and they invited her over, got her drunk, and then they killed her. But when they brought her body to the doctor, her beauty was so great that he couldn't bear to dissect her. And so he had her body sketched by an artist who posed her like the 1620 sculpture of Hermaphroditus. So this is Mary Patterson. It sounds really horrible, but it actually has echoes of the anatomical Venus. So these were wax models that were used in anatomy class. The preferred form was that of a woman, and students would open up the different portions of the body. But the anatomical Venus was always posed like this, with the lovely long hair and jewelry, really eroticizing the female corpse. Now, grave robbers knew that they could actually command a higher fee if they had the bodies of women, especially women who died in childbirth or while they still had while they were still pregnant. So that was like a 2-for-1 deal. There is actually a subgenre of art called anatomy art, and it does pretty much like what Dr. Knox had done to Mary Patterson, the way that it eroticized the female corpse. This is Hart's anatomy, the doctor who's standing over her body that still looks kind of almost lifelike, holding her heart. This is the dissection of a young, beautiful woman. And actually, I could find countless images like this where the medical students are all standing over and looking at awe at the female form as they unveil her mysteries. So back to our criminal, Burke. He is hanged at the gallows. Tens of thousands of people showed up for the execution. These executions, of course, were always entertainment. They were meant to be a deterrent. And it was stipulated, of course, as part of his punishment that he be dissected as well. And the surgeon who performed the dissection then dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." And then his skeleton was preserved, and it is on display in a museum in Scotland. So you can put that on your list of things to see. Now, this story becomes a form of popular entertainment. So at the time when people are reading about it, they're horrified by it, and they're very scared because they don't want this to happen to them. But over the years, it does become part of pop culture. A very enterprising older woman, Madame Tussaud, up here, has already made a career out of during the French Revolution. She would cast the heads of the aristocrats who had been executed at the guillotine and then make wax models of them. In her 70s, she moved to London and she set up shop. And she realized that the public probably didn't care so much about wax figures of aristocrats, but they would love to see those of murderers, notorious criminals. So Burke immediately became part of a display in 1829. Then he became a central feature of her Chamber of Horrors, where he remained one of the most popular exhibits until 1886. So decades later, the public was still fascinated by this story. This is a cartoon at the time in 1849, which shows all these respectably dressed middle-class Victorians lining up because they all want to see the celebrated murderers. They can't get enough of this kind of stuff. Now, Burke became both a noun and a verb. So to Burke was to commit a crime, and there were copycats, and Burkers were those who weren't grave robbers, but they were actual murderers. And so one famous copycat trio were the London Burkers. They did start out as grave robbers. They allegedly had stolen anywhere from 500 to 1,000 corpses for over more than a decade. And then they were inspired by Burke and Hare. And so they were going to start their little murder ring. In this case, though, when they brought the fresh corpse of a 14-year-old boy to the local teaching college, the doctor immediately alerted the authorities. He wasn't like Dr. Knox. He could see that there were signs of murder. So the authorities were notified, and they went to their dwellings over in the Shoreditch neighborhood, which is a pretty poor neighborhood of London. And when they searched the well and the outdoor toilets, the privy, they found evidence on the clothing of the victims. And they learned that they had had multiple victims, similar MO, Burke and Hare, drugging them, stuffing their body in the well until they could sneak them at night and try to sell them. Now, this story is particularly sad because that body of the boy, he becomes known as the Italian boy, Carlo Ferrari, although the Burkers themselves say that, no, it was actually a cattle drover who was headed to Covent Garden to sell his cattle. So we'll never know without DNA testing. But the corpse was described as around 14, 4 foot 6 inches, which really speaks to how malnourished working class children were. And there were a lot of homeless kids at this time. And they knew that these were the disposable ones of society that no one would miss. But fortunately, they got caught. And yes, they too were hanged and dissected as part of their punishment. Here is recreation in the press, the story of the poor Italian boy. And these stories were important because it drummed up sympathy for the victims, but also created this public panic that this could be anyone. Sure, right now they target poor kids, but what if I'm a middle-class person walking on the streets and they bop me over the head and sell my precious corpse? So there was a public outcry and pressure put on members of parliament to do something to put a stop to this. Meanwhile, this professional class of doctors, they wanted a steady stream of corpses and didn't want to rely on grave robbery and murder. So they also insisted that Parliament act. And so the solution that we get is the 1832 Anatomy Act. And under the terms of this act, if you happen to die in a workhouse hospital and no one claims your corpse for 48 hours, then those poor bodies will go to the teaching hospitals for anatomy class. Now, of course, there's a big outcry from members of the working class because they know that the people who end up in workhouses are people from their class, typically. So they see that they are once again being criminalized for being poor. And they stage protests against this law. But in 1832, they don't have the right to vote. So Parliament's not paying attention to the working class. Now, one leading advocate of the law, who you probably are familiar with, was Jeremy Bentham. He actually dies in 1832, but he championed this law because he believed that medicine needed to modernize, and therefore it needed a legal way of acquiring corpses. He so believed in this, but he understood that people weren't ready to donate their bodies freely. So when he died, he had stipulated that his body be dissected. He even chose a surgeon to do it. And then he wanted his skeleton preserved and put on permanent display. He called it his auto icon. So in the days before photography, this would preserve his form. And he said this was his service to humankind. Here's the original mummified head but this is the wax model that later replaced it. And he is still on display at the Royal College of London. Now, what ultimately leads to the decline of grave robbery, which continues even after 1832, because even with the workhouse supply, there's never enough bodies. Ultimately, with the embalming of corpses by the 1860s, so the bodies can last longer, that pretty much drives grave robbers out of business. But I do want to talk briefly about this institution of the workhouse, and we will cover this in more detail in my class, because this does become the place that starts to supply doctors with the corpses they need for anatomy class. And you ended up in a workhouse, this place where the Archway of Tears, you were so down on your luck through no fault of your own, usually disability, old age, accidents, debt. Men and women were kept in separate wards. Children, if they came in with their parents, were separated from them. It's a cruel institution that Dickens covers in Oliver Twist. But the workhouse hospital typically was filled with usually the elderly. And so they worried that no one would make any effort to save them. Who would alert their loved ones, who would also have to prove they could afford a burial? So it was the understanding that if you ended up in this workhouse hospital, you very likely would end up on the dissectionist table. Now, the new Poor Law of 1834, which leads to the building of more of these workhouses, has another amendment added to it, and that is called the Bastardy Act. And this leads to our next crime. So there was a concern among members of parliament that the illegitimate birth rate was simply too high in the 19th century, probably because of a lot of single women coming from the countryside and walking out with men who promised marriage, then they didn't marry them, and then they were left as unwed mothers. And the stigma around being an unwed mother, the stigma of being an illegitimate child, was so great at this time. And these women would likely be unable to find employment if they were unwed mothers as well. So there were people who took advantage of these vulnerable young women. They were baby farmers, and they would advertise discreetly in newspapers, I'm a loving couple, or I'm an elderly woman, and I love children, and I have a lovely farm. And for a monthly fee, I'll take care of your child for you, and you can visit whenever you want. And that's the desperate measure that many women relied on. They knew that they were often putting their children into the care of people who might neglect them. And there are a couple of very famous cases where baby farmers, like Margaret Waters, Brixton's baby killer, took in as many children as possible with the intention of harming them. She didn't care at all and continued to collect the fees from mothers, because the mothers I'm talking about often couldn't visit these babies for months on end. So when they would come and want to see their child, they would just be shown someone else's child and wouldn't know, because kids look different within a couple of months. Now, Margaret Waters is arrested and executed in 1870. And here she is. Here are a couple of sketches. Here is Mrs. Waters, as she's called. And really these ghoulish images of the children, because she has starved them to death, or she just sold them to other people. And sometimes she would just go out into the streets and she'd hand off the babies to just other children, not caring, what would happen to them, because that was her MO. She just wanted as many kids as possible to collect the fees and then get rid of them as a nuisance. So here she looks so harmless, right? You can almost feel sorry for her as she's about to go to her death. But she was the first woman to hang for baby farming, but not the last. As late as 1896, we have Amelia Dyer, the angel maker, and she just very casually strangled babies after she agreed to take care of them. And then she dumped their little bodies in the Thames River. It's possible she killed hundreds of babies. Now, how is this possible that they can get away with this for so long? First of all, there's a high infant mortality rate at the time. And these kinds of crimes almost become inevitable in an era where there's no reliable contraception. There's a sexual double standard that exists in law. So under the Bastardy Act, if a woman had a child out of wedlock, she could not claim support from the father. That was meant to be her punishment for her vice. And that's what led to desperate women seeking desperate measures like this and created criminals like the angel maker. Here's the kind of advertisement that Dwyer would have used. Married couple with no family will adopt healthy child, nice country home. Here's the press depiction at the time of Dwyer administering death to some of the children, and she's feeding them an opium-laced syrup called Mother's Friend. Now, this Mother's Friend actually was in a lot of households. So this is a Punch cartoon. The baby is left alone sleeping. It's been fed opium by the mother, who probably is out working or running errands and has no one to watch her child. When poor parents had a sick child, just to calm them, keep them quiet, they would give them the tea mixed with these opiates. But it wasn't just working class and poor who relied on it. The joys of motherhood couldn't be possible without these tonics. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, if your child was teething. So this is a lovely middle-class home. This is probably the nanny or the nurse taking care of the child for the mother. It was in everybody's medicine cabinet. Okay, so let's now move to our queen for something that's not so dark, more of a scandal than a crime. And as I said, so Victoria is the great-great-grandmother of the queen who just passed away. And they actually share a lot in common. They are the only female monarchs in history, in British history, who had to juggle marriage, motherhood, and monarchy. We often think of Victoria as this old, dour grandmother of Europe. But she comes to the throne as just a young, lovely, petite woman who likes champagne and dancing. She's 18 years old. And immediately there are many people who are naysayers who think that she can't possibly assume such responsibility. She's lucky in the fact that she has guidance from the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. But they spend so much time in each other's company that rumors spread. And this is the age of newspapers, and they are starting to be developed more and more into tabloid-like papers, and they follow her relentlessly. And journalists will shout out when they see her in the company of the older Lord Melbourne, Mrs. Melbourne, Mrs. Melbourne. He had to prepare her, a lot of responsibility on those 18-year-old shoulders. She has to give her first speech to this room full of older men, some of whom are hoping she fails. But with his guidance, she quickly moves into this role with confidence. But there's nothing she can really do about the scandal. Here we see her out riding with Melbourne, someone else trying to get her attention because they feel that he's hogging up her attention. Now, Melbourne was much older. He was pushing 60. But he himself, here he is, had always been embroiled in scandal. When he was much younger, his wife, Caroline Lamb, had that notorious affair with Lord Byron. She's the one who called him mad, bad, and dangerous to know. A year before he becomes prime minister to this queen, he was sued for criminal conversation, which was adultery, with the wife of George Norton. Norton had actually tried to blackmail him for £10,000, and he said no way. So he took him to court, charging him with adultery. The court ruled against Norton and in favor of Melbourne, but that scandal hounded Caroline. And on his deathbed, he said that there had never been more than a friendship, a platonic friendship. So anyway, this is a guy, scandal just follows him everywhere. If you've watched the TV series Victoria, you'll see how Melbourne at 60 has suddenly become much younger and much hunkier. And the show really plays up this growing romantic tension. And that is largely based on the royal gossip. There's always these people living in the palace who spread malicious gossip. She couldn't bear that he should be out of her sight. If Melbourne left the room, her eyes followed him, and she sighed when he was gone. Now, how do you put those kind of rumors to rest? Because she's a young, single woman. And you have to remember that the security and the future of the whole line of succession must be kept safe and pure. So we can't have the queen eventually marrying with any illegitimate children on the side. So there's all this talk, we need to get her married. She insists that anyone she marries must be someone she's in love with, someone she's attracted to. So she wants a say in picking her spouse. And she chooses her German cousin, Prince Albert. And this is their wedding portrait. You'll see she's wearing the white bridal gown, which was already the favorite of many aristocratic brides. But Victoria is really embraced by this growing middle class that have become much more powerful and wealthy in this age of industry. And middle-class women adore her, and they start to copy the white wedding gown. Now, Victoria, we learn from her diaries, quite enjoyed the physical side of her marriage. And the night after her, or the day after her wedding night, she writes about the hugs and the kisses and how he clasped her. She doesn't go into too much detail, but we get the sense that they had a very passionate marriage, which ultimately leads to her being the mother of 9 children. It was that side that she did not enjoy so much. She said that, having so many children made her feel like a cow, like an animal. And it also took her away from her royal duties. And as much as they loved each other, she did resent the way that he sometimes used her constant pregnancies to try to assume more power within the royal household. Nevertheless, when the marriage ended, because Albert dies, leaving her a widow of 41, she says her life is a happy one, has ended. And she goes into mourning, but such a deep mourning that it drags on. And the public, who has had a queen that's been pretty accessible, who they love, now is nowhere to be seen. Someone actually puts a sign on Buckingham Palace that says premises to let. They want their queen back. And so her royal physicians realize they have to get her out of her funk. And she and Albert already had a favorite servant, John Brown, who took care of their horses at their palace, their castle in Balmoral, Scotland. And so they call him to London and they're like, okay, cheer up the queen. The problem is that he's too good at his job, and she spends so much time in his company. He calls her woman. He even carries her at one point, and it just is scandalous, the closeness, because she's a widow. So whether she's 18 and unwed, it's scandalous when she's in a man's company. But now she's a middle-aged widow, it's scandalous. Even the queen must behave. And the fact that he's working class, I think that also irks a lot of people. But as she said, he's devoted to me, so simple, so intelligent, so like an ordinary servant, so cheerful and attentive. And she did not treat him like any ordinary servant. Of course, this has become the stuff of popular culture. Judi Dench, who always plays the queen, if you've seen the film Mrs. Brown, it does speculate. There's much that we don't know because the letters between the two were destroyed by her children. So it's possible that this was a more intimate relationship than we may think possible. After he died in 1866, she wore his mother's gold wedding ring. She wore that until her own death and was buried with that and a lock of his hair, along with mementos of her husband. So he was the best, the truest heart that ever beat. This quote from the Viscount Cranbrook, too, is very interesting when he says, the queen feels that life for the second time has become most trying and sad to bear, deprived of all she so needs. The blow has fallen too heavily, not to be very heavily felt. So for the second time, putting John Brown, her servant, on the same level as her dead husband does make one wonder. Here is a statue that she erected to him on the grounds of Balmoral Castle. And we know this queen loved to erect statues. She erected plenty in honor of her husband and doing one for her good friend. So the Mrs. Brown scandal. And this was a scandal that everyone was talking about. This is the French media making fun of the queen. And I find this so horrible, the way that they depict her as this grotesque woman, exaggerating her body and facial features, the very thought of a 45-year-old woman. And of course, we've seen how this always happens to powerful women, women in politics, how they're made grotesque by the media. Okay. Now, let's turn to the larger context. So Victoria presides over our Victorian era, and this is the context for a couple of scandals and crimes I want to cover now. Here is a lady poisoner that we'll be talking about. Victoria presided over an era that we associate as Victorian, but she basically gave her name to some values that were already in place, largely because of this growing power of the middle class. She endorsed them and tried to live out some of those values as well. The primary value of the age is this whole culture surrounding the home and domesticity, showing off all that the breadwinner has achieved, his leisured daughters who are accomplished at the piano, the intimacy of the family in the evening, and the idealization of womanhood as the angel in the house. In fact, this is a best-selling poem by Coventry Patmore. And that term angel refers to women, typically of the middle class, whose role is within the home to be the moral and spiritual guide. And these are women who are so virtuous, and they stay virtuous throughout their whole lives. The queen, as I said, embraced this, always appearing in her portraits and in public with members of her large family. If you look quickly at this image here, you see the kinds of clothes that they're wearing. They look like an ordinary middle-class family. In fact, aristocratic women hated her fashion sense. They thought it was too dowdy. But she knew who she was catering to, and that was middle-class women, and they copied her fashions. So what happened when women weren't the angel in the house, when they were dark angels, and when they committed crimes within the home, the space that was supposed to be sacred, a haven in a heartless world? And instead, behind closed doors, we see through so many court cases that was often not the truth, that these were sites of rape and incest and domestic abuse, spousal murder. And in the case of Mary Ann Cotton, probably the most notorious serial killer in Britain, it's a really frightening place, the home. Mary Ann Cotton, as this newspaper coverage from July 1872, she was arrested and she will be tried, convicted, and hanged for murdering over 15 family members. Those are the murders that we know of. And most of them were her own children that she had with several men. But what's so interesting, because her weapon of choice was arsenic, in the corner is an advertisement for arsenic lotion, because arsenic featured in so many products, from ladies' face cream to wallpapers and clothing and even beer. It was completely unregulated by the government. So it's kind of odd that they're advertising this as they're talking about a woman who killed her children and husbands with arsenic. She also killed a mother-in-law. She was finally caught. So she started her crimes at a young age. She had been a great beauty. She was working class from the northeast of England, and she married William Mowbray, had 8 children with him, 7 of whom died of gastric fever that he succumbed to as well. And she collected life insurance policies on him and on her children. But as the crimes continued, it's kind of difficult to think that it was just for a financial motive, that perhaps, I think today, maybe there would have been suspicion of mental illness. So nevertheless, she goes undetected for quite a while. Her crimes become the stuff of street theater and plays, even, at the time it's happening. There's a popular nursery rhyme that immortalizes Mary Ann Cotton, dead and she's rotten, lying in bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, what should I sing? Mary Ann Cotton, she's tied up with string, because everybody wants to see her die for what she did. Now, I have this little quote here because this is part of the vernacular at the time. Quiet or I'll spice you a pie. And it speaks to that dark power that women can have within the household. Women control the medicine cabinet. They control the kitchen. So if you misbehave, you better watch it, because you never know when they may take that nurturing side and the side that feeds us and use it for something darker. So can women be trusted? Now, as I said, how could she get away with this for so long? For almost 20 years, okay? Well, she moved around a lot. There was that. And gastric ailments were so common among working class and poor children. These aren't her children, but this photograph really speaks to the poverty in some of these neighborhoods where homes that were crowded together, they didn't have indoor plumbing. They shared an outdoor water source that could be contaminated. And poorer families never called in doctors because it was too expensive. And these are children who are already weakened by malnutrition. So their passing from a gastric fever would go undetected. No one's performing postmortems on them. And yet one doctor did become suspicious, which is how she's finally caught when the only child that survives is the one that she's actually pregnant with when she's arrested for her crimes. Okay, now it was the stuff of popular entertainment at the time it happened, and it's lived on in the 21st century. So everybody's favorite domestic servant at Downton Abbey, Anna Bates, the actress plays Mary Ann Cotton in this TV series, Dark Angel. At the time, the stuff of fiction and real life often bled into each other. Mary Elizabeth Braddon becomes a best-selling novelist with her sensation novel, Lady Audley's Secret. And that's about a wife who kills her husband and stuffs him in a well and carries the secret with her. She was borrowing elements of Marion Cotton and also the Constance Kent case. This is another case, a 16-year-old who stabs to death her 4-year-old half-brother or stepbrother. And even when she confesses to it, the policeman refuses to believe it. How could a lovely young woman of the upper middle class commit such a horrible crime? The novelists are borrowing elements from real life, and the public simply can't get enough of it. Okay, now regarding arsenic, why it is so common. Again, as I said, unregulated by the government. The only thing you had to do was to sign a register if you were procuring arsenic at the pharmacy, because this was usually to kill rats in the home, which was a common problem. But otherwise, arsenic was in so many products, as I said, like these creams for ladies' complexions, and this lovely green color that becomes popular in wallpapers and in dresses. It has arsenic. So you may be familiar with the Paris green. This becomes a fashion sensation. But a lady who wears this dress, she's making a fashion statement. She's not going to wear it enough to be poisoned by it. It's the working class women who are making these dresses. And there is actually a case of a woman who's poisoned to death by it. But Punch magazine is making fun of the arsenic waltz, that women would be so vain, even knowing of its dangers, they would still wear this dress. And you could see they were being warned about the skin ulcerations and some of the other harms that they would get from wearing this. But this is a case where women, fashion, they're willing to die for it. It's just that dress is so spectacular. Okay, so arsenic features into another notorious crime, that of Florence Maybrick. And she is arrested and put on trial in 1889, the year after Jack the Ripper. And so she gets dubbed the female Jack the Ripper, even though there's just one victim, and it's a totally different type of crime. So here is Florence. She was American, and that actually is a strike against her for some people at the time. She was about 20 years younger than James Maybrick. So Florence meets James on a ship, and he presents himself as being wealthier than he is. He's actually constantly in debt. She's presented herself as being wealthy because she's in search of a husband. And so the two, by the time they land and they've gotten to know each other, they quickly marry soon afterwards. They have 2 children. She will never see them again after her arrest. They'll ultimately be raised by friends of his. And they proceed to live in this home in Liverpool. And you could see from the outset, it's very lovely, comfortable, upper middle class. Victorians love to give names to their homes, and this one is so apt, Battle Crease House, because behind those nice doors is a couple that is battling constantly. Before he married Florence, he actually had a common law wife in the Whitechapel neighborhood and had 5 illegitimate children. But he proceeded to be a serial adulterer after marriage. In fact, he took arsenic tonics because he believed it was an aphrodisiac. So there is some people who believe, well, maybe he just poisoned himself. So they had much to argue about. Also, his finances were not great. She tended to spend too much money, and that put stress on the marriage. And there's a servant in the house, too, who seems to have it out for Florence, who's always spreading malicious gossip about her. Now, James, according to his doctors, was a bit of a hypochondriac. He had one illness after another, so they never took him that seriously. So when he comes down in 1889 with this sudden gastric ailment that doesn't seem to be getting better, now the doctors are a little bit concerned because James's brothers are suspicious of Florence. They've been watching her because the servant has told them that Florence had an affair. She had recently supposedly had a weekend away at a hotel with one of his business partners. When James found out, he beat her severely. She left the home, but then friends convinced her to go back for the sake of the children. And then soon afterwards, he fell ill and didn't seem to get better. And the brother said, she's not attentive enough. She doesn't seem to be too upset. So at one point when he's vomiting, they insist that the doctors test the vomit for poison. There's no poison to be found. So then one night when he dies, Florence is asleep. The brother is there, and they insist on having the doctor perform an autopsy right there on the bed. And they with really no evidence, Florence is arrested. She has an inquest that lasts, almost like 10 minutes, and she's brought to trial. And here we have the newspaper sketch of this woman in her widow's weeds trying to plead her case. Now, the prosecution in this case, it was the same prosecutor who had actually sealed Mary Ann Cotton's fate. So very interesting that he had these two high-profile cases. Ultimately, there was very little evidence that she had poisoned him. He didn't have enough arsenic in him to have killed him. And in fact, if we did an autopsy of most Victorians, there's going to be traces of arsenic because, as I said, it was just in every product in the home. So because of that, because the judge wasn't so convinced, her sentence was commuted. And there were a lot of feminists at the time, too, who were rallying around her, saying that this just shows a sexual double standard. He had affairs, but she's the murderer. But the prosecutor said a woman who would commit adultery, it's pretty easy for her to commit a murder. So she ultimately serves 15 years, but she has these champions who keep fighting her cause. And she has actually some doctors and scientists who fight for her. And so they finally get her sentence dropped. She's done 15 years. And after that, she goes free. But really, her life is ruined. She goes on the lecture circuit, talks about her lost 15 years. She writes an account of it, but then she moves to Connecticut. She changed her name and she dies poor. She's known to neighbors as the Cat Lady. She is the source of inspiration for Agatha Christie, who writes, of course, about many arsenic poisoners. Now, the real Jack the Ripper, which is what I'll end tonight's talk with, the two simply can't compare. Between August and November of 1888, 5 women are killed, their bodies, several of the bodies viciously mutilated. And of course, the public's fascination remains to this day because Jack is never caught. But it's a story that's more about the killer. It's about the culture at the time, especially the poverty in this area that he has targeted. Now, as I said, even at the time, the media only cared about finding Jack's identity. There was no sympathy for his victims. One newspaper described them as drunken, vicious, miserable wretches, whom it's almost a charity to relieve of the penalty of existence. It's always been assumed that his victims were prostitutes, but the historian Hallie Rubenhold, in her book, The Five, actually traces the backstories for his 5 victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Of the 5, it's 27-year-old Mary Jane Kelly, who was known in the neighborhood as a prostitute, and took the killer back to her lodging where he had time to mutilate the corpse. The other killings tended to be much hastier. And we learn Mary Ann, or Polly Nichols, for instance, she was 42. She had been married. She had battled alcoholism. She was unemployed at the time of her death, and she needed to get some money for a lodging house. It's not really believed that she was prostituting herself, but she just happened to be on the street, and this guy was looking for someone to kill. And yet the media has this little cartoon of her with her smart bonnet, kind of hinting that why is this woman so vain that she's wasted money on a bonnet when what she really needs is a lodging house for the night? So perhaps it was vanity and she should be blamed for her death. And in fact, the media does do that. They write about the neighborhood, the East End, Whitechapel neighborhood, which is very poor. And yet it's a thriving neighborhood where women all know each other and gossip and share childcare responsibilities. And they recalled the victims as women who could sing, who were kind. But that's not what sells newspapers. But these neighborhoods get dubbed Murderland by the media. And it really does, it hurts the reputation of the area, and it leads to a slum clearance shortly afterwards, which just further dislocates the impoverished. Here's the evil quarter mile. So a small section of the East End where these crimes occur. The media, makes some fun of women who are rightly scared. And it's not just poor women in the area, it's women all across London and the nation. The media is making them feel afraid because they're being warned as they take their security and freedoms for granted. As they move about the city at night, dangers await them. And so in London, it's women, of course, who get a curfew and not men. And men, meanwhile, they cross the west end of the city to the East End, staging Hunt the Ripper parties. Some dress as women to lure Jack and turn it into a big game. And a new expression enters the vernacular: quiet or I'll ripper you, that men and boyfriends say to unruly wives and girlfriends. Now, one theory at the start, though, was that no Englishman could commit such a horrible crime. And so Jack the Ripper is dubbed Jacob the Ripper. And this leads to targeting of Jews, Jewish immigrants in the East End neighborhood of Whitechapel. So here you see the sketch. There had been an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe who were fleeing persecution, and they came and they established homes and businesses. But the native-born English working-class neighbors were very resentful, and they used the Ripper killings as an excuse to attack businesses and residents until the police finally stopped it. All sorts of other theories. Was it a doctor? Was it a butcher? Was it a woman? Was it a syphilis-crazed former client of a prostitute? But ultimately, with the emergence of modern psychology, the prevailing theory is that it was someone who likely led a double life or had a split personality. And that's what's so scary. It could be anyone that you know, a gentleman by day who crossed the city at night, as many men did, in search of prostitutes. And instead, his search led to murder. And that was what's so frightening, that you don't know who people really are. And as I started my talk, of course, 2 years before Jack the Ripper, Stevenson had published his novella, Jekyll and Hyde. But you didn't have to take a potion to unleash that beast. And other stories appearing shortly afterwards about, the picture of Dorian Gray or Dracula, that you don't know the harm that lies beneath, the beast with the face of a man. And that's very frightening. There's, other ways in which this crime shows the thinking at the time. Even before Jack the Ripper, you could take a slumming tour, but Jack the Ripper makes this more popular, where you're coming from the nicer area and you get on an omnibus at midnight and you want to see how the other half lives from a safe distance. It really trivializes poverty and turns it into entertainment. But Jack the Ripper has become entertainment. Madame Tussaud immediately did an exhibit, although because she didn't know who he was, it's like a shadowy figure. A few years ago, money was raised for a museum of women's history, but the city council in London decided a Jack the Ripper museum would bring in more money with tourists. And if you go to London, you can visit this museum and exit through the gift shop and get all of these cute little tokens of your visit. And of course, there are Jack the Ripper tours. You can get it in Ripper Vision. And when you listen to the tour guides, they play with a lot of the details. And Hollywood has had one version of Jack the Ripper after another. And you just have to look at the movie posters to see how the victims have been eroticized, like our anatomical Venuses, not capturing the reality of the victims' lives. And just this year, a vaping company marketed a product called Jack the Dripper, which really, it ignores the seriousness of these crimes. And I just want to end with one literary figure. In the aftermath of Jack the Ripper, Sherlock Holmes becomes increasingly popular. Conan Doyle had already created him a couple of years prior to the killings, but the public had lost confidence in Scotland Yard that they couldn't catch this killer. And so they needed a character like Sherlock Holmes, who always gets his man, the first scientific detective. And Conan Doyle is, of course, showing how the art of detection is becoming more modern with forensics, chemical analysis, typewriter key analysis, footprint, and fingerprinting. Holmes hasn't made this up. These are things which are actually being used now in the detection of crime. But even our heroes have a dark side. When Sherlock Holmes is asked by his friend Watson, which is it today, morphine or cocaine? And he answers, it's cocaine, a 7% solution. Would you care to try? And Watson, of course, says no. He is a drug addict, but cocaine wasn't banned in the UK until 1920. And it was in all of these products, such as toothache drops for children. So our Victorians, they have a double side. They often have a dark side. They often have a side they can't control. Here's the passage of another queen at the dawn of the 20th century in January 1901. Some historians say the Victorianism, though, outlived the queen, that it actually dies in World War I. Some, like myself, say that we're left with the legacy of the Victorians, even today. Like them, we share some similar values about gender, class, poverty, crime. And with our crime podcasts, we are fascinated by scandal and crime. I think we always will be. And Virginia Woolf born at the very end of the Victorian period, as much as she rebelled against it. In her final novel, she said, "The Victorians, you and me, just dressed differently." And with that, we will end and take questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It was a really good lecture. I know some people were commenting in the chat as well. They were really interested. And so we have a few questions, and I'll jump right into them. Let's see here. So we had someone that asked, how did the Victorians know that a crime had been committed? Today, we have so many cameras to record crimes. So how did they find out? And how did they know?
Well, and that's one of my points, is that a lot of crimes went undetected, especially poisoning. They could be passed off as gastric ailments. And not everything would lead to an autopsy. But if you were suspicious enough, you could demand it. And I think the wealthier you were, doctors would comply. Most people, of course, who die in poorer homes, doctors aren't even called to that. So there's that. I mean, the police are not completely incompetent. And in most crimes, even today, people are careless. They make mistakes, obviously. And so they do get confessions.
And then Erin had a question about the monarchy. And so I believe it was she, I'm sorry if it's he, but did the monarchy ever speak publicly about some of these notorious murderers or their victims?
Oh, it's interesting because the Florence Maybrick, in that case, there was a plea to the Queen. So this group of feminists wrote a letter to the Queen and asked if she would intercede on Maybrick's behalf. And actually, the Queen said, no, that dreadful woman. I think she wanted to see her hang. So typically, no, she didn't. Just as she didn't weigh in on politics, she didn't weigh in on this.
Interesting. And it looks like Gillian, how much influence did the scandal sheets have in court matters? And also, didn't a royal come under suspicion in the Ripper case? So 2 questions in one.
Yeah, there's been so many theories. A member of the royal family, the Queen's royal physician, and to this day, we just don't know. Okay, and the scandal sheets, absolutely. So, for instance, if you watch Bridgerton, you're familiar with scandal sheets in the Regency period. Newspapers are becoming so powerful, really since the Regency period through the 19th century. And by the 1880s, they're actually even more tabloid-like. And we begin to see the emergence of government by journalism. Now, one story I'll talk about in my course is that of W.T. Stead and how he uses the Pall Mall Gazette to actually lead to a change in the age of consent. And he uses it by creating a panic about what was called the white slavery trade. I don't want to reveal too much, but that actually showed how journalists had the power to push legislation and get it passed. Now, the problem too, how do you get an unbiased jury when they're doing constant reporting? And of course, it's the jury pool is upper middle class men. There's no women. Some cases, if they had details that were too sexual, women were banned from the courtroom. And then, of course, there were people who were just lining up because they wanted to hear this. And in Florence Maybrick's case, because so much of the coverage was about she was American, she was a bad wife, she was an adulterer, I think that swayed the jury, absolutely.
And another question from Jan. So she said she's a fan of authors like Anne Perry. How accurate do you think her Thomas and Charlotte Pitt stories are?
Okay. And that's funny because one of the very first articles I wrote as a graduate student was about Anne Perry, because I'm fascinated by the neo-Victorian, how contemporary authors use that Victorian past, whether it's in detective stories or period dramas. And I think Anne Perry she does quite a very good job. She's a meticulous researcher. But I think she idealizes too much about the Victorians in the relationship of Thomas and his wife, that whole domestic culture. At the same time that the women push back, she also romanticizes it. But in terms of a lot of the details, especially in policing, I think she's pretty good. So I would recommend her.
And it looks like Mary had a question. So this was during your presentation, so it might relate to a particular topic, but she wanted to know, how did the murders of Irish Catholic orphans evolve from this cultural horrendous killing spree?
Is she referring to at like those the homes for the unwed mothers where a lot of corpses have been found?
I believe so. Mary, if you're in, you want to clarify in the chat, please do. But do you want to move on to another question and then come back?
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think there's going to be a TV series or a movie about this. It's such a horrible story, but this speaks to my point, like about the Bastardy Act, the stigma of being an unwed mother, the shaming of unwed mothers, and the shaming of illegitimate children. So there were these homes for unwed mothers, and these were places that were very cruel, where the women were shamed, made to be penitent, put to do hard labor, and then the children were taken away from them. Now, the idea was to adopt them out, but what we discover is that some of them are killed or they die and they're just easily disposed of. So it is a dark history. And I do think it's tied into the attitudes, the sexual double standard and the harshness of the laws that punish women and not men for their indiscretions.
Great. Yep. And that answers Mary's question. And then I guess just because we're going over just a little bit, I guess we'll take this one last question, which is from Olivia, which is 2 questions. How and why did you choose the topic for your conference? And then 2, Victoria seemed to have a joy of life and a limited possibility to give in to it once she became a queen. However, Victorianism almost stands for narrow-mindedness in many ways. So,
okay. So that's why you have to take my class, because in our first class, we look at some of those stereotypes that surround the Victorians and how we've come to use that word Victorian, right, as stuffy, hypocrites, prudes, when in fact, they're much more complicated than that, right? Syphilis is the top killer. Prostitution is booming. Pornography is a multi-million-dollar industry. So they have this other side. And they also do have a lot of fun. The Queen, of course, in her photographs, and you know what Victorian photography is like. You have to look so serious because it takes so long. There is one photograph of her smiling. And yes, she actually did have a good sense of humor. Queen Elizabeth II was always accused of the same thing, when in fact, she loves a good joke, right? Or she loved a good joke. So we do have these stereotypes about the Victorians that were created actually by Virginia Woolf and her generation of modernists, because they were breaking away from that. Why did I choose this topic? Well, because I teach the Victorians to my students at Maryland. I'm fascinated by this time period. And I do think that this is something that connects us to the past, this fascination that we have in scandal and crime, but also how it highlights these disparities of class and gender that persist to this day. And I want you to see, if you take my class, that we do share so much with the Victorians, though it is in this distant past. Americans had a Victorian period as well, even though they didn't have a queen. And we're left with that legacy today. And I want you to appreciate them, because there is much that's fun.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Looks like that's the end of the questioning. I know there's some few questions, but I'll send you the chat just so that you could read it if you're interested. And I want to thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. It was fascinating. I'm looking forward to October 6th when your class is. I will stay. I'll keep the Zoom room open for a little bit, and I'll stay to answer anyone's question about the course if anyone has any. But with that, I want to turn over final thoughts, final comments to you. And yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Whether you take my class or not, one thing I hope you will do is to continue your interest in history, especially British history. Pay attention to the upcoming news as we reflect on 70 years of history with the passing of Victoria's great-great-granddaughter. I want to thank you for letting me be part of Forever Scholars.
Well, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to October 6th. And thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a good evening, everyone.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye.